What's up guys, I'm Sega Lord X, and in this episode we're going to be talking about Game Gear shoot 'em ups. Now, when you think of the Sega Game Gear, you don't really think of a big shoot 'em up machine. But believe it or not, the system actually had a number of really decent games. As a matter of fact, in this video alone I'm going to cover 16 shoot 'em ups for the system. So, I hope you guys like shoot 'em ups, I hope you guys like the Game Gear. Let's get started. Released in 1990 originally for the Sega Master System, and then in 1992 for the Game Gear, Aerial Assault was developed by Sanritsu, and was one of the first horizontal shoot 'em ups I'd play on the system. It's as straightforward as shooters go, taking place across 5 levels and having your typical power-ups like homing shots and shields. Boss battles end each area, but the challenge here isn't going to push you to your limits. The graphics are colorful, yet suffer from severe repetition, and the stages are overly long with repeating music tracks that can begin to grate. It isn't bad though, and later levels definitely help change up the rhythm and flow of things quite a bit. This one is really cheap loose, and an easy addition to your Game Gear library. Choplifter III here is a direct sequel to the Game Boy edition of Choplifter II, and was released in 1994 by Extreme Entertainment Group and developed by Beam Software. Once again, you fly your trusty helicopter into battle to rescue hostages and defeat enemy tanks, gun placements, soldiers, and various other obstacles, even Mother Nature. This one plays very much like the original Choplifter, but I had some trouble with turning when I wanted to attack enemies below me. It made for some frustrating deaths, but once I got used to it I really did begin to enjoy the game. It isn't anything special in the graphics and sound department, but this is a challenging experience with some decent replay value. It was only released in North America, so you may have to import it if you are outside that region. This is another cheap one for the Game Gear, and totally worth the price of admission. The Game Gear would see a 1994 port of the popular 16-bit shooter Desert Strike, ported by T-Rex and published by Domark. This overhead isometric shooter is more methodical than most shoot 'em ups. You fly your attack copter into the war zone, where you are then tasked with various missions that involve destroying satellites, rescuing soldiers, and securing payloads. You have to worry about things like ammunition, fuel, and just about everything else a helicopter needs to bring the pain. Gameplay takes some getting used to, requiring you to master maneuvers like strafing and which weapons work the best with what enemies before you really get anywhere. This one isn't as deep or as fun as the 16-bit source material, but it's still surprisingly fun. You can often find this one for a tenner at most places that carry Game Gear games, and I definitely recommend it at that price. Drop Zone was released by Codemasters exclusively in Europe in 1994, and developed by Big Red Software. This left and right horizontally scrolling shooter is patterned directly after the arcade classic Defender, right down to the map screen and objectives. Even the graphics look extremely similar, making this one a home run for fans of that game in particular. It's challenging too, with enemies that appear out of nowhere peppering the play area, and our hero only needing one hit to be decimated. This one can be rare and expensive complete in box, but loose copies are far easier to find and afford. I wouldn't go out of my way to find it, but if you roll up on one for 10 to 20 bucks, it's definitely a unique piece for the Game Gear collection. (1991) would bring the Game Gear its own version of Fantasy Zone, entitled Fantasy Zone Gear, developed by Sanritsu. This one would be quite different from the Sega Master System and arcade original, adding new stages, enemies, and the ability to change weapons and add-ons via the pause menu. It uses the Game Gear's extended color palette to improve the visuals as well, but loses the radar that shows the enemy bases. This adds additional challenge to the game, forcing you to search for bases instead of going straight to them. The music is decent and the challenge is there in later levels, making this fantasy zone perfectly acceptable for a portable experience. Another one that goes super cheap. It's seen in stores single digits sometimes. Don't pass this one up at those kinds of prices. Galaga 91 was developed and released in 1991 by Namco. It's a port of the original Galaga 88 arcade game, expanding Galaga's gameplay by adding scrolling levels, bonus stages, and new enemies. I first played a home version of this on the PC Engine, falling in love with its laid-back action and great music. The game shines here on the Game Gear as well, though it does take a hit in detail and music quality. It was never released in North America, and is known as Galaga 2 in Europe, so you may need to import it if you are in the US. While not ultra expensive, a complete copy will sit you back around $30, a worthwhile price if you're a fan of the original content. Japan would be the only place to see Game Gear Aleste, or Aleste, however you want to say it, developed and released by Compile in 1991. Very similar to the other games in the series, this is definitely a solid effort. It paints a fair bit of stuff on screen for a portable shoot 'em up from that era, with multiple layered backdrops and some really nice power-ups. Its release exclusively in Japan has greatly limited its audience for years, but with emulation and flashcards the norm, it's easy to give this one a go today. It would see a vastly superior sequel a few years later, but this one is still very playable, with a great challenge and some very nice visuals. If you want to own a physical copy of the game, prepare yourself for a search. In the time since its release, I've never seen a legit copy with my own eyes, and that's saying something considering my experience. Geolock Air Battle was a 1990 release by Sega. It's based on the awesome arcade game of the same name. The portable version here is a simple game with basic missions. Destroy 10 planes here, destroy 5 bases there. Choose your mission at the very beginning and off you go. You can also upgrade your plane in between missions with better weapons and add-ons. It's played first-person style with simplistic graphics and sound. Despite the very bland description, this one here is actually a decent portable experience. It's nothing special, but the base game is quite enjoyable and easy to get into. The difficulty is manageable, and there's enough missions to keep you playing until you beat it. It's also one of the cheapest games on the system, often going low single digits in the budget bins. Griffon was released exclusively in Japan in 1991 by Renovation Games, and developed by Telenet Japan. This overhead vertically scrolling tank shooter is quite unique on the system. The stages do not auto-scroll, leaving you to pace yourself and take on enemies as you see fit. Don't let that make you think this one is easy, because it's not, challenging gamers from the very moment you take control. It could have been truly one of the better shooters for the system had the power-ups been made more varied and robust. Instead, you always feel like you are stuck with a pea shooter that never has enough damage potential. Still, it's a good playing game for the system, and one you should definitely try. Its Japanese exclusivity of course means it's rare, and a complete copy goes for hundreds of dollars. Published by Taito in Japan and Sega in the West, Halley Wars is a vertical shoot 'em up with surprising speed and great enemy variations. Stages present environmental dangers as well, keeping the player on their toes. I really enjoyed this one, but the repetitive backdrops and lack of multiple layers really keeps the game looking simple without any kind of flash that shooters are typically known for. The sound and music aren't anything to write home about either. The boss battles are nice though, and the power-ups keep your interest in the fight for the entire journey. You can get this one for a good price if you look hard enough, and I'd say it's a good $20 game for your collection. Magical Taruruuto-kun, or however the hell you say it, was released in 1991. This Japanese-only horizontal shooter has all the makings of an excellent experience. Colorful graphics that do the system proud, check. Great upbeat soundtrack to accompany said colorful graphics, check. Power-up system that allows you to mix and match the weapons and items you want, check. That makes this one a great game then, right? Nope. It is let down terribly by the excruciatingly slow gameplay. I mean, it basically crawls in the beginning, and even after a few power-ups you find yourself just wishing things would move along at a greater pace. This is the lone problem of this experience, and one that I simply can't overlook. I'd say it's still a good one to look up and give a try, but man does it need some afterburners. This one is shockingly not hundreds of dollars despite its Japanese exclusivity, so it's easy to add to your collection. Released ultra late in the system's life, Panzer Dragoon Mini would be launched exclusively in Japan in late 1996 by Sega themselves. Attempting to capitalize on the success of Panzer Dragoon, we'd see a severely scaled back version of that series here. Playing more like Space Harrier with a lock-on targeting system, Panzer Mini gets a lot of heat from folks. I enjoyed it though, especially the attempt to bring the gameplay and sounds from one of my favorite series to the portable scene. While it graphically is of course nowhere near its cousin on the Saturn, I applaud the efforts of bringing the multiple camera angles to a 2D system. At various times during gameplay, the camera will slide to a side or behind the back view to allow you to attack bosses and enemies from different angles. The sound design is also damn solid for the hardware, recreating the classic tracks from Panzer II in 8-bit form. While many will see this as just a cut-back version of a much better game, I take it at face value. There's nothing broken here, and if you enjoy the likes of Space Harrier and similar games, I think you'll like this one too. A complete copy of the original cart has fallen squarely in to the collector's domain of insanity, so give this one a go on your favorite emulator or flash cart. (1993) would see one of the Game Gear's best shooters, Game Gear Aleste, or Aleste, or Aleste 2 in Japan, also called Power Strike 2 in Europe. Developed by Compile and released by Sega, this vertically scrolling sequel is superior to the first in every single way. It's faster, has a better power-up system, better graphics, better sound, and has more happening on screen. Quite simply, this game is better than most 16-bit shoot-em-ups, and a credit to the Sega Master System and Game Gear hardware. It's challenging, and holds your attention the entire way, a rarity for old shooters on portable machines. It was never released in North America, which of course means that it's expensive, but this one here is one of the few Game Gear games that I feel may be worth its higher price tag. Its fantastic combination of speed, sound, and power-ups really set it apart from other games in this video. Even if you do not collect for the Game Gear, fire it up on an emulator at least and give it a go. Space Harrier would even get the Game Gear treatment, but boy is it tough to play this one. Released in 1991 by Sega, I know I shouldn't expect anything near the arcade on the Game Gear. But Space Harrier needs a certain smoothness for its gameplay to really shine through, and much like the Sega Master System version, this game is really choppy. Objects do not as much scale towards you, but more flashing towards you in a few frames. This really puts the gameplay at odds with what I want, making this experience one I'll not be returning to. For those of you more forgiving, the graphics themselves are colorful, and the sound design is actually quite good. Temper your expectations, and you may enjoy this one a lot more than I did. Published by Domark exclusively in Europe in 1993, Super Space Invaders here is exactly what you'd expect. Little ship that travels along the bottom of the screen while alien ships attempt to destroy it. This one adds new backgrounds and enemy patterns, but is largely still the same Space Invaders you know from the arcade. It's simple fun that warrants a $5 at most. Our last game is one I hope burns in its own special hell. Published by Sega in 1995 exclusively for Japan, Tails Skypatrol isn't a traditional horizontal shooter by any means. Even though you assume control of Tails from Sonic the Hedgehog and fly through stages avoiding obstacles, this pile of trash is more a death simulator than anything else. I've never felt so damn useless in a game in my life, seeing the continue screen here more than any other game I've ever tried. I mean, all Tails has to do is get near anything at all in this headache-inducing experience and he crashes, starting you over to go through it all again. I mean, for the love of God, Tails is a kid's character, and this was no doubt meant to be a child's game. No life bar and instant deaths riddle this frustrating experience with nothing but hair-pulling insanity. To add insult to injury, this travesty sells for crazy amounts on eBay. I rarely say a game is unplayable and completely without merit, but the developers of this garbage should be ashamed of themselves. Not only did it waste my time here and cause me incredible frustration while capturing video, I turned it over to my 11-year-old daughter to see her reaction, a near immediate facepalm and white flag from someone who was no doubt the game's target audience. You've been warned. Stay far, far away. So there we go, guys. Shoot 'em ups on the Sega Game Gear. Now, while I was making this episode, I kinda came to a realization. The Game Gear is actually not a bad machine to collect for. Many of the system's better games are still really affordable. I sorta was checking out some of the prices of some of these shooters, and then I started looking at other genres as well, and many Game Gear games don't cost a fortune. The Game Gear is really accessible if you have any interest at all. Another cool thing about the Game Gear is that the Game Gear is emulated to near perfection these days, which means that if you want to try out these games to see if they're actually worth your time, there's a number of emulators that can do that for you. Also, there's flash carts available for the Sega Game Gear, and a number of these Game Gear games actually have Sega Master System variants, so you can always look at those games there. Either way you look at it, the Sega Game Gear was a pretty decent shoot-'em-up machine. It didn't have the powerhouse games the way the Sega Genesis did, but for an 8-bit portable, the library wasn't too bad at all. I'm Sega Lord X. Thank you guys for watching. I'll catch you next time.